My daughter took a shaky breath, the sound of it sharp and brittle in the afternoon stillness of our home. Her gaze flickered past me, as if looking at someone standing just over my shoulder. Then her eyes locked onto mine, and the bottom fell out of my world. "Give me your phone," she said, her voice a raw scrape, "and the bank codes. Now, before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story." It was the tremor in her hand that I saw first. My daughter, Nia, stood there clutching her phone so tightly the knuckles were white peaks in a landscape of fear. She always had a flair for the dramatic, a trait she inherited from her father, but this was different. This wasn't a performance for an audience of one. The stage was our sun-drenched living room, a space I had designed with principles of minimalist calm, all clean lines and muted earth tones. The floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto a meticulously manicured garden, a world of controlled, intentional beauty, and into this serene equation, Nia had just introduced a variable of pure chaos. She had come in from the garden entrance, which was odd. She never used that door. The air around her seemed to shimmer with a frantic energy that was utterly alien to the space. Her art school clothes, usually a carefully curated statement of dishevelment, were just rumpled, as if she'd been sleeping in them. There was a faint, damp scent clinging to her jacket, the smell of recent rain, but the sky outside was a perfect, cloudless blue. My mind, a machine built to register and analyze such discrepancies, flagged it immediately. Data point 1. Illogical precipitation. I was seated in my favorite armchair, a sleek leather eames that had been my one concession to classic comfort. A half-finished cup of jasmine tea cooling on the coaster beside me. The market had just closed, and I had been reviewing the day's performance of my portfolio. A quiet, satisfying ritual of numbers and patterns. It was a language I understood, a world of predictable logic and calculated risk. The system I had built for my life, both financial and personal, was designed to eliminate variables, to create a firewall against the kind of disorder that Nia now radiated. She took a shaky breath, the sound of it sharp and brittle in the afternoon stillness. It was the sound of a twig snapping underfoot in a silent forest, a tiny crack in the placid surface of my day. Her gaze flickered past me, darting towards the hallway, then the kitchen, as if checking for unseen observers. It was the furtive movement of a cornered animal. My own systems began to hum with a low-level alert. My heart rate remained steady. Panic is a corrupting process, a waste of energy, but a cold, clean stream of adrenaline began to perfuse my veins. I did not move. I simply watched, gathered data. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large they nearly eclipsed the warm brown of her irises. Fear. A profound systemic fear that went beyond a bad grade or a fight with a friend. This was a primal signal, a biological alarm bell ringing somewhere deep inside her. Her skin, usually a rich, healthy brown, was ashen, stretched taut over her cheekbones. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Data point 2. Significant physiological distress. Finally, after a silence that stretched for an eternity of seconds, her eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant, the bottom fell out of my carefully constructed world. The numbers on my tablet, the quiet hum of the house's climate control, the scent of jasmine tea, it all dissolved into irrelevant background noise. There was only the raw, terrifying signal being transmitted from my daughter's eyes. "Give me your phone," she said, her voice a raw scrape, as if the words were being dragged over shards of glass. It was not her voice. It was a sound stripped of all its familiar melody, its warmth, its life. She took another step into the room, and then another. She held out her free hand, the one not strangling her own phone. The tremor was more visible now, a fine, high-frequency vibration that seemed to originate from her very core. It was the hand of a stranger. "And the bank codes," she added, the words tumbling out in a rush, desperate and sharp. Now. The command hung in the air between us, a piece of malicious code, injected into the clean operating system of our lives. It was illogical. It was irrational. It was an impossibility. Yet, there it was. My daughter, my brilliant, volatile, creative child, stood before me, demanding the keys to my entire world, with the voice of a mugger in a dark alley. My mind, ever the analyst, refused to process the emotional impact. Instead, it did what it was built to do. It isolated the threat, defined the parameters of the problem, and began methodically searching for a solution. The first step was to acquire more data. The first step was to understand the nature of the attack. The system of my mind, which in moments of crisis ran a diagnostic protocol honed over decades. Bypassed the emotional response matrix entirely. Panic, outrage, hurt. These were inefficient, high-latency processes. They could be dealt with later, archived for a time when the primary threat was neutralized. Right now, the core objective was data acquisition and threat assessment. Nia's demand was the presenting symptom, but I needed to understand the disease. So I didn't shout. I didn't rise from my chair. I held her gaze, my own expression a carefully calibrated mask of calm inquiry. I took a deliberate slow sip of my now tepid tea, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the suddenly turbulent water. I set the cup down with a soft, deliberate click, the sound unnaturally loud in the charged silence. Then I deployed my first diagnostic tool, a single disarming question. Why? The word was quiet, devoid of accusation. It was a simple request for information, the kind of question a programmer asks of a malfunctioning line of code. It had an immediate and visible effect on Nia. She flinched as if the word had been a physical blow, her already fragile composure shattered. Don't ask me that," she stammered, her eyes darting away from mine, down towards the phone she was gripping in her right hand. "I just need them. Please, Mom. It's important." Her use of Mom was a calculated vulnerability, an appeal to the very emotional response I was suppressing. But it was her gaze drawn inexorably back to her own phone that gave me the next critical piece of information. The screen was dark, but in the reflection from the window I saw it illuminate for a fraction of a second. A line of text appeared in a green bubble before vanishing just as quickly. A messaging app. A live conversation. He was watching. Or, at the very least, he was listening. My hypothesis shifted. Nia wasn't the aggressor. She was the delivery mechanism. A hostage forced to read a ransom note. Her desperation wasn't born of greed. It was the frantic energy of someone with a gun to her head. A digital gun perhaps, but a gun nonetheless. My entire threat model reconfigured in a nanosecond. The target wasn't my assets. The target was Nia. My assets were merely the weapon being used against her. And in that moment, I knew. Giving her the codes would be like handing a loaded pistol to the man holding my daughter hostage. It would not save her. It would only validate his power, prove his method, and escalate his control. Compliance would be a catastrophic failure. I kept my voice level, my posture relaxed. Inside, the adrenaline was crystallizing into something cold and hard. Resolve. "No," I said. The word was as soft as my question, but it carried the absolute, unyielding weight of a bank vault door swinging shut. It was not a negotiation, it was a statement of fact. Nia stared at me, her mouth falling slightly open. This was not a response she had anticipated. She had clearly been coached, prepared for an argument. For tears, for anger. She was not prepared for this quiet, immovable finality. The script she had been given had no lines for this scenario. "What?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mom, you don't understand. You have to." "I understand that you are terrified," I replied, my eyes flicking meaningfully towards her phone. "And I understand that someone is making you do this. But the answer is no, Nia. I will not give you or them the keys to our world." The color drained completely from her face. I had acknowledged the third party. I had called the bluff. On her phone screen I saw another flash of green text. Then another, more insistent this time. He was getting angry. The tremor in her hand worsened, becoming a violent shake. "Please," she begged. And now the tears came, hot and fast. "Please," he said. He said he would. She couldn't finish the sentence, a sob tearing the words apart in her throat. She took a stumbling step backward, her body curling in on itself as if to absorb an invisible blow. The sight of her pain was a physical assault. The suppressed emotional processes began to hammer against their containment walls. The mother in me wanted to run to her, to hold her, to promise her anything to make the terror stop. But the analyst, the strategist, knew that to do so would be to lose the war in the first minute. I had to remain the anchor, the calm, unmovable point in her hurricane of fear. If I panicked, we were both lost. I had to get her isolated, get the listening device away from her, and then I had to go to work. The time for defense was over before it began. It was time to build a fortress. The sight of my daughter crumbling was the most potent weapon he had. Her ragged sobs were tactical strikes against my composure. I knew, with chilling certainty, that every sign of her distress was being monitored, reported back to the unseen enemy. and used to calibrate his next move. The immediate priority was to break that feedback loop. Nia, I said, my voice firm but gentle. I rose slowly from the chair, my movements measured and non-threatening. Come with me. She shook her head, her body racked with tremors. I can't. He's watching. I know, I said, closing the distance between us. I didn't reach for her phone. That would be a declaration of war. He might retaliate against instantly. Instead, I placed my hands on her shoulders. Her muscles were knotted with tension. He is watching you fall apart. That is what he wants. We are not going to give him that. I steered her gently but irresistibly out of the living room and down the hall towards her bedroom. It was the furthest point in the house from my office, a deliberate choice. As we walked, I kept my voice low, a soothing murmur. You're going to go to your room. You're going to lie down. You are not going to respond to any more messages. Do you understand? The conversation is over. She nodded numbly, a ghost of her former self. I opened her bedroom door. The familiar chaotic artist den, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. I guided her to the bed, and she sank onto it, curling into a fetal position. I pulled her duvet over her trembling frame. For a moment I allowed myself to place a hand on her hair, a brief silent transmission of a love so fierce it was a physical force within me. Then I drew back. The mother's role in this act was over. The operator's was about to begin. I left her room, closing the door softly behind me. And the moment the latch clicked, the switch flipped, the soft maternal posture straightened, the calculated calm in my eyes hardened into something colder, sharper. My gait became purposeful, efficient, silent. I did not run. Panic is the enemy of precision. I walked, with the contained energy of a predator, directly to my study. I locked the door. My office is my sanctuary, my command center. It is the one room in the house that is a complete black box, shielded against all electronic surveillance. I sat at my desk, a single slab of polished obsidian, and my fingers found the hidden release for the biometric safe built into its pedestal. It opened with a soft hiss, revealing not money or jewels but the tools of my trade, a set of encrypted hard drives, a satellite phone and a small featureless burner phone. I ignored my main computer. It was connected to the home network and I had to assume that network was compromised. I powered up the burner phone. It had only 2 numbers stored in its memory. I dialed the first. It rang twice before a clipped familiar voice answered. No greeting. Phoenix Fire, I said. It was the code phrase we had established over a decade ago. My private banker, a man who owed his career to a data breach I had contained for him, knew what it meant. Acknowledged, he replied, his voice flat with professionalism. Parameters? Total asset lockdown. All accounts. Personal, investment, trust. No outgoing transfers. No withdrawals. Nothing. Freeze it all. Authorization code Sierra Tango November 77. Code confirmed. Execution time. Immediate. I want every digital door sealed by noon. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:42 a.m. It will be done, he said, and the line went dead. One down. I immediately dialed the second number. This one was for a man named Jacob, my former lead network security architect, now a highly paid private consultant. Anani. He answered, a rare exception to the no greeting rule. Jacob, I have a situation. Home network is potentially compromised. I need you to execute a system purge and hard reset. Protocol Erebos. There was a moment of silence. Erebos was the most extreme protocol, a digital scorched earth policy we had designed for corporate warfare. It wouldn't just reboot the system, it would wipe every connected device, every smart bulb, every thermostat, every security camera and reinstall the base firmware from a secure off-site server. It was total electronic annihilation and rebirth. Are you sure? He asked, a hint of concern in his voice. I'm sure. I cut him off. I need a clean slate. And I need it 15 minutes ago. Understood, he said, the concern replaced by resolve. Going dark now. The line clicked off. I placed the burner phone back in the safe. The calls had taken less than 90 seconds. I had spent years of my life building this fortress of wealth and security. And in the space of 2 minutes I had pulled up the drawbridge, flooded the moat and sealed every gate. The money was safe, not for its own sake but because it was the leverage being used against my daughter. I had just disarmed him. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly. The house was unnaturally quiet. Outside my window the sun shone, the birds sang, The world was blissfully unaware of the silent invisible war that had just been declared within these walls. I looked at the clock again, 11:59 a.m. A single bead of sweat traced a path down my temple. The lockdown should be complete. I had taken away his prize. Now I had to wait and see how the thwarted beast would react. The silence that followed the lockdown was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of my morning ritual. It was the breathless, charged hush of a vacuum, the dead air after a nearby explosion. I sat in my office, every sense on high alert, listening, not with my ears but with an instinct honed by years of navigating treacherous digital landscapes. I was listening for the system's response, the counter-move from the ghost on the other end of the line. The first sound came from down the hall. It was not the electronic chime I had expected, but something far more visceral, a small sharp cry of pain from Nia's room. I was out of my chair in an instant, the cold precision of the operator momentarily overwhelmed by the raw instinct of the mother. I crossed the hall in 3 silent strides, my hand on her doorknob. I didn't open it. I paused, forcing myself to re-engage the analytical part of my brain. Rushing in would be reacting to his stimulus. I needed to observe. From within the room I heard a frantic scrabbling sound, then a choked sob. Her phone. It had to be her phone. Despite my instructions, she was still connected to him, still a conduit for his poison. The sound of her distress was the confirmation I needed. The lockdown had worked. He had tried to access the funds, hit the wall of ice I had erected, and was now lashing out at his only available target. I opened the door. Nia was sitting up on her bed, her back against the headboard, knees drawn to her chest. Her phone lay on the duvet in front of her. Its screen was lit, and from the doorway I could see the rapid-fire succession of green bubbles appearing. He was raging. She looked up at me, her face a mask of renewed terror. "He knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He knows what you did." I walked over and sat on the edge of her bed, my eyes fixed on the screen. The messages were a torrent of fury and threats. A digital tantrum. "What did you do? Where is the money? Your mother thinks she's smart. She isn't. You will regret this. Both of you." Then a new message appeared. It wasn't text, it was an image. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of our house. Not a generic satellite image from the internet, but a clear high-resolution photograph, taken from the street, from a low angle, as if someone were crouching behind the sculpted hedges that lined our property. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. The timestamp in the corner of the image read 12:03 p.m. It had been taken moments ago. He wasn't in another country. He wasn't in another city. He was outside. The threat was no longer an abstract string of text on a screen. It had a physical location. It was breathing the same air, standing just yards away. The digital ghost had manifested. Nia let out a sound that was half whimper, half scream. She scrambled backward on the bed, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the phone, as if it were a venomous snake. "He's here," she gasped, her eyes wide with a horror that was beyond anything I had seen before. "Oh God, Mom, he's here." I felt a flicker of fear then, a cold sharp icicle touching my heart. It was not for myself, it was the primal animal fear of a mother whose child is being stalked by a predator. My fortress had walls of code and firewalls of finance. But it was still just a house with windows and doors, a house that suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable, made of glass. But fear, like panic, is a luxury I could not afford. I stood up and walked to Nia's window, which overlooked the front garden. My movements were slow, deliberate. I did not peek through the curtains. I stood to the side, using the angle to scan the street. A quiet suburban lane, a mail truck making its slow way down the block, a woman jogging with a golden retriever, a gardener's van parked 2 houses down. Nothing out of place, nothing overtly threatening. And that was the genius of his move. He had made the ordinary menacing. Every passing car, every person on the street, was now a potential vessel for the threat. He had turned our peaceful neighborhood into a hunting ground. I turned back to Nia. The digital tantrum on her phone had stopped. A single new message sat on the screen. "I see you. Tell your mother the game has changed. This isn't about the money anymore." I looked at my daughter huddled and broken on her bed. I looked at the image of my home, now a target. I looked at the menacing words on the screen. The game had indeed changed. He had escalated from digital extortion to physical intimidation. He thought it would break us, that it would send us scrambling to meet his demands. He was wrong. He hadn't broken us. He had just made a fatal mistake. He had given me a new objective, not just to protect my daughter but to hunt him down and remove him from the board entirely. And in doing so he had just given me a place to start looking. The physical threat, the chilling immediacy of that photograph did what his digital rage could not. It shattered Nia's final wall of resistance. The secret she had been protecting, the loyalty she felt to her tormentor, whether born of fear or some twisted form of manipulation, crumbled to dust. The predator was no longer an abstract concept on a screen. He was outside, and the raw animal instinct to seek protection from her mother finally overrode everything else. She began to talk, the words pouring out in a frantic, disjointed torrent. I let her speak, pulling a chair from her desk and sitting beside the bed. I became a receptacle for the information, a calm, stable presence in her storm. My mind sorted the emotional chaff from the factual wheat, archiving the details, building a timeline, constructing a profile of the enemy. His name, or at least the name he used, was Silas. She had met him online, not on a dating app, but in a niche forum dedicated to experimental digital art and generative coding. It was a space she loved, a community where she felt understood. He had presented himself as a fellow artist, a prodigy. His work was brilliant, she said, complex and beautiful. He understood her passion in a way she felt I never could. There was a pang of something, jealousy, hurt, but I pushed it aside. Irrelevant data. He had charmed her over weeks. Private messages became hours-long video calls. He was charismatic, attentive, flattering. He praised her art, offered to collaborate, spoke of a future where they could create revolutionary work together. He built a foundation of trust and intimacy, a classic social engineering tactic. Then came the hook. He told her about his other hobby, cybersecurity. He framed it as a form of digital artistry, a way of understanding and manipulating systems. He impressed her with small tricks, guessing an old password of hers, showing her how to access a supposedly private database of stock photos. To her it seemed like magic, a thrilling peek behind the digital curtain. To me it sounded like a predator demonstrating his claws. The manipulation began subtly. He needed her help with a project. Could she install a small piece of software on her laptop to help him run a complex rendering? She did, unknowingly giving him a backdoor into her entire digital life. From there the escalation was swift. He discovered old embarrassing photos, private journal entries, conversations she'd had with friends. He never threatened her outright, not at first. He framed it as a concern, a way of protecting her. But the implication was clear. He owned her past. The demand for money came last. It wasn't for him, he claimed. He was in trouble with dangerous people. A story custom-built to elicit sympathy and fear. He had targeted her from the beginning. I realized he had seen the daughter of Imani Adebayo, a name associated with wealth and tech, and he had patiently, methodically set his trap. Nia wasn't just a victim of opportunity. She was a calculated target. What is his handle? I asked, keeping my voice steady when she paused to take a ragged breath. The name he uses on the forum. She looked at me, her eyes clouded with shame. Glitch, she whispered. Silas Glitch, Cross. The name was arrogant, a boast. It was another piece of the profile. He was a narcissist. He believed in his own legend. Narcissists made mistakes. They got cocky. They left trails. In the forum I pressed gently. I need the name of the forum, Nia. The exact URL if you can remember it. She squeezed her eyes shut, concentrating. It was called The Canvas. Not the art supply site. It was different. The Canvas.io, I think. The Canvas.io. It was a small thing, a name, a URL. But in my world, it was everything. It was a digital address, a starting point, a single, muddy footprint in the vast, trackless wilderness of the internet. It was the first breadcrumb on a trail that I would follow back to its source. The entire sprawling, terrifying problem had just been distilled into a single, actionable piece of intelligence. Okay? I said, standing up. That's good, Nia. That's very good. I took her phone from the bed. Her hand twitched, a reflexive urge to grab it back, but she let it go. I powered it off completely, severing the last connection. The listening device was now inert. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice small, a child's voice. I looked down at her, my daughter so brilliant and yet so vulnerable. The answer was simple. I'm going to my office, I said, and I'm going to dismantle him. I walked out of her room, her phone in my hand, and locked her door from the outside, a move that felt both protective and imprisoning. Then I walked to my study, locked that door behind me and sat down at my desk. The time for defense and investigation was over. It was time to go hunting. My office, my sanctum, was where the persona of Imani Adebayo, the mother, was shed, and the operational capabilities of Imani Adebayo, the analyst, came online. The room was designed for this specific purpose. The walls were lined with sound-dampening acoustic panels. The single window was made of ballistic glass and coated with a radio frequency blocking film. There was no Alexa, no Siri, no connected device that hadn't been physically vetted and secured by my own hands. It was a Faraday cage with a comfortable chair. I ignored my sleek modern work laptop and turned instead to the machine tucked away in a ventilated cabinet beneath my desk. To a casual observer, it was an obsolete relic, a heavy black tower case from the late 90s, devoid of any branding or decorative LEDs, but its unassuming exterior was a deliberate camouflage. Inside it was a custom-built powerhouse, a digital ghost rig running a bespoke hardened version of the Linux operating system. It had no Wi-Fi card, no Bluetooth. Its only connection to the outside world was via a single shielded Ethernet cable that I now plugged into a dedicated isolated port in the wall. A direct encrypted line that completely bypassed the compromised home network. This machine was air-gapped from my life. It was my weapon. The boot process was not the slick, instantaneous startup of a consumer device. It was a deliberate, multi-stage security check. I entered a 64-character passphrase, then a two-factor code from a physical security key I retrieved from the safe. The screen came to life, not with a friendly graphical interface, but with a stark, black screen and a blinking white cursor. The command line. This was my native environment. My fingers, which had felt clumsy and foreign while stroking my daughter's hair, now found their element. They moved with a speed and certainty that was pure muscle memory, a language I had spoken fluently for 30 years. I ran a series of diagnostic commands, checking the system's integrity, ensuring no processes were running that shouldn't be. The machine was clean, a sterile surgical theater. Now for the tools. I navigated through encrypted directories, my keystrokes echoing softly in the silent room. I accessed a suite of network analysis, data forensics, and penetration testing tools I had written or modified myself over the years. These were not the off-the-shelf programs used by amateur hackers. They were tailored, precise instruments as familiar to me as a sculptor's chisels. My first step was to obscure my own presence. I routed my connection through a series of chained virtual private networks, bouncing my signal between servers in Zurich, Tokyo, and a research station in Antarctica. To anyone trying to trace me, my digital ghost would appear as a flicker of data from the bottom of the world. I was a phantom. Only then, cloaked in layers of digital anonymity, did I open a minimalist, security-focused web browser. The interface was stark, text-only by default, loading no scripts or images unless I explicitly commanded it to. It was slow, cumbersome, but secure. My fingers paused over the keyboard for a moment. This was the point of entry. The moment I typed in that URL, I would be stepping from my fortress into his territory. I took a slow, centering breath, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum. The fear for Nia had not vanished. It had been transmuted, forged into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He had invaded my home, threatened my child, and turned my daughter's passion into a weapon against her. He thought he was a ghost in the machine. I was about to show him what a real ghost looked like. I typed the address Nia had given me. thecanvas.io. The cursor blinked once, twice. Then with a final keystroke I pressed enter. I sent my phantom hurtling through the dark corridors of the internet, down the rabbit hole to the digital den of the man who called himself Glitch. The hunt had begun. The website loaded not as a vibrant splash of art and color, but as lines of raw HTML in my text-only browser. It was the site's skeleton, its source code laid bare. This was exactly what I wanted. A graphical interface is a distraction. A curated experience designed to guide a user. The source code is the unvarnished truth. I spent the first 10 minutes just reading it, my eyes scanning the structure, the scripts, the comments left behind by the developers. It was like a detective examining a crime scene before the crowds arrived. The site was well built, but contained traces of older, less secure frameworks. Potential vulnerabilities. I noted them for later. Next, I enabled a minimal rendering of the site, just enough to navigate its structure. The canvas was a sophisticated community. It had forums, project collaboration spaces, and a showcase for members' digital art. It was also, I quickly realized, a perfect hunting ground. The culture was built on reputation and technical prowess. Members, especially the arrogant ones, loved to show off. I didn't search for glitch directly. A direct search would be logged, a digital footprint. Instead, I began to pull the forum's public data, using a custom script to scrape member lists, post histories, and user metadata. It was like signing a river, collecting everything so I could sift through it at my leisure on my own secure machine. The process was slow, deliberate, designed to mimic the crawl of a search engine bot to avoid tripping the forum's security alerts. While the data downloaded, I began my manual search, looking for the patterns, the digital echoes, of the man who had terrorized my daughter. I didn't look for his name, I looked for his behavior. I searched for posts that mentioned specific coding techniques he had used to impress Naya. I looked for a tone arrogant, condescending but highly skilled. I found him within the hour. Not through his username but through a piece of generative art he had posted 3 months prior. Naya had described it to me, a swirling, chaotic nebula of light that slowly resolved into a photorealistic human eye. It was tagged with a single word panopticon, and the artist's handle was glitch. I clicked on his profile. It was a digital shrine to his own ego. He had been a member for 2 years. His post count was high. He was a pillar of the community, a self-styled guru, and he was sloppy. I began to dissect his post history, and a clear, damning portrait emerged. He offered help to younger, less experienced members, particularly young women. His initial interactions were always encouraging. Then he would move the conversation to private messages. I couldn't read those, but I could see the pattern. A public courtship, followed by silence. Several of the accounts he had interacted with in this way had gone dormant weeks later. One had posted a cryptic final message, "Be careful of the ghosts who offer gifts." Then I found the technical boasts. In a thread discussing VPN security, he had arrogantly dismissed a commercial provider, bragging that he used a specific boutique service based in Estonia, known for its unbreakable encryption. He even mentioned his preference for their Stockholm server node, claiming it had the lowest latency. Data point. Critical. In another thread, a debate about data recovery, he scoffed at a user's problem. "Your data is never truly gone," he wrote. "I once recovered a whole drive for a client from a single corrupted file fragment. The key is to know where the system stores its shadows." He then posted a short, elegant script as a proof of concept. I analyzed the script. It was brilliant, but it also contained a stylistic signature, a specific way of commenting his code and structuring his variables, that was as unique as a fingerprint. It was a piece of his digital DNA. He was a predator who masqueraded as a savior, using his intelligence to identify, isolate, and control his victims. He fed on their admiration before he consumed their assets. He had done this before. Nia was not his first. My jaw tightened. I would make sure she was his last. The data scraping finished. I now had a complete public record of the forum on my machine. I initiated a new script, a correlation engine. I fed it his digital fingerprint, the coding style from his script, and set it loose on the entire database, looking for that pattern anywhere else on the site, under any other username. I was no longer just tracking his past. I was hunting for his aliases, his sock puppets, his entire digital infrastructure. I was mapping the full extent of his web. And with every line of code that scrolled past on my screen, I felt the net I was weaving around him grow tighter. He must have felt the subtle probes, the ghost of my presence tickling the edges of his domain. A predator as skilled as him would have tripwires and digital alarms. I couldn't possibly anticipate. He had been the hunter for so long, he would recognize the feeling of being watched. His response was not to flee, it was to attack. The first sign was a flicker. The recessed lighting in my office, which I kept at a steady warm 2700 Kelvin, blinked once, then twice. It was a change in the system, an anomaly. My home network, which I had ordered Jacob to purge, should have been a clean slate, but the smart home controller hub was a physical device. If he had planted a deeper exploit in its firmware, a rootkit that could survive a hard reset, he might still have a way in. I immediately killed the power to the office lights at the circuit breaker, plunging the room into the dim glow of my monitor. Too late. The large 4K screen on the opposite wall, which I used for reviewing architectural plans and high-resolution data charts, flickered to life. It was not connected to my secure machine, but to the home network. On it, a series of images began to cycle, one after the other. It was the live feed from my own security cameras, the front gate, the garden, the hallway outside my office door, the camera in the living room, showing the empty armchair where I had been sitting. He was showing me his access. He was showing me he was inside my fortress. Then the audio system integrated throughout the house crackled to life. It wasn't music, it was a low static hiss, the sound of an open channel. A voice emerged from the static, distorted and synthesized, a robotic mockery of human speech. Clever, little analyst, the voice droned, the words seeming to come from the very walls around me. Did you think I wouldn't notice you, scurrying around in the dark corners of my world? My hands never stopped moving. While his monologue played, I was already typing, my fingers a blur across the mechanical keyboard of my secure rig. I was running a network sniffer, analyzing the data packets flowing into the house's central router. He was sloppy, arrogant. The attack was noisy, a brute force display of power, not a subtle infiltration, and that meant it was traceable. You took my money, the voice continued, the synthesized tone pitching up in a crude imitation of anger. A foolish move. A temporary inconvenience. I don't need your money to own you. The security feed on the screen switched. It now showed the camera from the hallway pointed directly at Nia's bedroom door. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. You can't hide your money, the voice echoed, and you can't hide her. I found it. The incoming data stream was heavily cloaked, routed through multiple proxies, but the final entry point was a vulnerability in the Smart Hub's emergency alert protocol, a backdoor he had left for himself. I had him. I have everything, the voice boasted. Her journals, her photos, her private conversations with her little art school friends. I have every secret she ever thought she had. Would you like me to share one? With a final series of keystrokes, I compiled and executed a command. It was a digital scalpel. I targeted the specific exploit he was using and severed the connection. The big screen went black. The speakers fell silent. The house was quiet again. I had kicked him out. But it was a temporary victory. He knew the layout of my defenses now. He would find another way in. He was playing with me, enjoying the psychological torment. He thought he was in control. He thought this was his game, played by his rules. A cold, burning rage settled deep in my bones. He had threatened my child. He had invaded my home. He had broadcast his voice into my sanctuary. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Defense was no longer a viable strategy. Kicking him out wasn't enough. I had to create a trap, a lure so irresistible, he would abandon all caution. I had to bait him, draw him out of the shadows, and into a cage of my own design. I had to turn his greatest weapon, his greed, against him. The rage I felt was a cold, efficient fuel. It did not cloud my judgment. It sharpened it. The attack on my home had been a critical error on his part. It told me he was impulsive, driven by ego. It told me that when his plans were thwarted, he defaulted to intimidation rather than stealth. And it told me he was still at his core, motivated by the money. The lockdown had infuriated him precisely because it had worked. That was his vulnerability. I would build my trap around it. A direct assault on his systems would be a fool's errand. He would expect it, and his defenses would be formidable. I needed him to come to me. I needed to create a honeypot, a digital Venus flytrap so alluring he would be unable to resist sticking his hand inside. The plan formed in my mind, a clear and logical schematic. I would create a new, seemingly vulnerable cryptocurrency wallet. I would seed it with a substantial tempting balance. And then I would accidentally leak the credentials in a place I knew he was monitoring. Execution required precision. I used my secure rig to navigate the labyrinthine world of decentralized finance. I didn't use a mainstream well-known platform. I chose a newer, more obscure blockchain. One known for its privacy features but also for its occasionally buggy, complex interface. The kind of environment where a user mistake would be plausible. I created the wallet. The string of characters that formed its address was a meaningless jumble of letters and numbers. Then came the bait. I couldn't use funds from my frozen accounts. That would be too obvious. Instead, I used a reserve of clean crypto I kept on an offline hardware wallet for emergencies. This was an emergency. I transferred the equivalent of $250,000 into the new wallet. The transaction was public, visible on the blockchain. A glittering lure dropped into the digital ocean. The balance was high enough to be life-changing, to make a man like him greedy and reckless. Now, for the trap itself. The wallet wasn't just a container for currency. I embedded a tiny custom-written piece of code within its metadata, a smart contract that would lie dormant until the moment a transfer was initiated. This code was my masterpiece of malice. The instant he tried to move the funds, it would execute. It wouldn't block the transfer. That would be too simple. Instead, it was designed to function like a digital die pack. It would latch onto the intruder's system, bypass his proxy servers by exploiting the very protocol he was using, and broadcast his true IP address, his machine's hardware signature and a full directory of his running processes directly to a secure listening server I controlled. It was a Trojan horse filled not with soldiers but with spies. The final, most delicate step was leaking the credentials. It had to look like a genuine catastrophic mistake on my part. I thought about the systems he had already breached. He had been inside Nia's laptop. He had been inside the home network. He likely still had access to remnants of our cloud-based services, shared calendars, photo albums, document repositories. I created a new file in a shared family cloud drive, a space he would surely be monitoring. I named it Estate Planning Emergency Access. Inside, I wrote a series of fake instructions, a panicked-sounding note from me to my lawyers. I wrote about needing to move assets to a more secure, untraceable location due to a security incident. And at the bottom of the document, I pasted the wallet's private key and access phrase. I made it look like a frantic, desperate boomer who didn't understand technology, who would foolishly copy-paste their most sensitive data into an insecure document. I was playing a character laying a trail of breadcrumbs made to look like my own incompetence. Then, to make it even more irresistible, I deleted the file. Deleting the file from a cloud service rarely erases it immediately. It's moved to a trash folder, a digital purgatory from which it can be recovered. A hacker of his caliber would know this. He would see it as the ultimate prize, a secret I had tried and failed to hide. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. I closed the document, emptied the trash folder and logged out. Now there was nothing to do but wait. I sat in the silent, dim light of my office, my eyes on the monitoring software connected to my listening server. It was a blank screen, a quiet ocean, but I knew, somewhere out there in the depths, the shark was circling. While I was waging my silent, digital war, Nia was fighting a battle of her own. I had locked her in her room, a decision I'd made for her safety, but in doing so I had also isolated her with her own fear and guilt. She was pacing her floor, a caged animal, listening to the unnatural silence of the house, punctuated by the distorted voice that had bled through the walls from my office speakers. She had heard his threats. She understood, perhaps for the first time, the true nature of the monster she had let into our lives. The helplessness was eating her alive. For years she had seen me as a figure of suffocating control. My systems, my protocols, my constant analysis of risk. It had all felt like a cage, a criticism of her more fluid, artistic nature. She had sought out Silas precisely because he seemed to be the antithesis of me, a free spirit who moved through the digital world without rules. Now she saw the truth. My control was a shield. His freedom was a weapon. Listening to the sounds of the attack, she was no longer just a victim. She was a witness to her mother fighting a monster she had invited in. The guilt was a physical weight, but beneath it something new was taking root. A desperate need to contribute, to be part of the solution, to do something, anything to help. She sat on her bed, forcing her mind back through the weeks of conversation with Silas. She pushed past the flattering words, the shared dreams, the promises. She tried to remember the other things, the moments he had let his guard down, the moments his ego had overtaken his caution. Narcissists always boast. They can't help it. They need to be admired for their cleverness. And then she remembered. It was late one night. A few weeks ago, he was showing off, demonstrating how he could bypass a university's firewall. She had been impressed, and her admiration was the fuel he craved. High on his own success, he had started bragging about his setup, his operational security. Amateurs use Nord or Express, he had scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. Predictable, I use a private service, a little boutique firm out of Estonia. End-to-end quantum-resistant encryption. They only have a handful of servers. I prefer the Stockholm node, lowest latency, to my targets in the States. It had meant nothing to her at the time, just a string of technical jargon, but now, the words echoed in her mind with a sudden startling clarity. Estonian service. Stockholm node. Then, another memory surfaced. He had been criticizing her laptop's performance. Your problem is you're still using a standard DNS, he'd said. You're letting your ISP track your every move. You need to use a custom resolver. I use one from a company called Veracity DNS. They don't keep logs. They're based in Switzerland. Their primary resolver address is 8. He had been teaching her how to hide, but in doing so he had revealed his own methods. They were tiny details, fragments of a much larger puzzle, but she knew with a certainty that cut through her fear, that they were important. She looked around her room, a desperate need for paper and a pen. Her art supplies were everywhere. She grabbed a charcoal pencil and a blank page from a sketchbook. Her hands were still trembling, but her movements were purposeful now. She wrote down the 2 pieces of information, her artist's handwriting clear and precise. VPN Estonian service, Stockholm server, DNS Veracity, DNS 8.2929.100. She tore the page from the sketchbook. The problem now was how to get it to me. Her door was locked. She didn't want to shout to alert him if he was still listening somehow. She looked at the bottom of her door. There was a small gap, a sliver of light from the hallway. She folded the paper into a tight small square. She got on her hands and knees, her heart pounding. It felt like a scene from a spy movie, absurd and terrifyingly real. She pushed the note into the gap, wiggling it, forcing it through to the other side. It was a tiny act of rebellion, a quiet, desperate gambit. She had no idea if the information was useful, or if I would even find it, but she had done something. She had taken a piece of the poison he had fed her and tried to turn it into a cure. She had stopped being the victim and had become a source. She had joined the fight. I sat in the unblinking gaze of my monitor, a sentinel in the digital dark. The trap was laid, and the waiting was a unique form of torture. A silent, high-stakes game of patience. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence in the house was absolute. There were no more attacks, no more taunts. This was the quiet of a predator stalking its prey, or perhaps the quiet of a prey sensing a trap. I almost missed it. There was no klaxon, no flashing red alert. It was a single discrete line of text scrolling into the log of my listening server. Intrusion detected. Honeypot wallet metadata access. He was in. My heart gave a single hard thump against my ribs, and then the cold calm descended again. He hadn't tried to move the funds yet. He was cautious. He was examining the wallet, probing its structure, checking for traps. He was smart, but his ego and his greed were smarter. I watched the logs as he poked and prodded. He was using a series of proxies, his signature bouncing between servers in Russia, Brazil, and Indonesia. He was a ghost, a phantom. If I had relied on a standard trace, I would have lost him in the noise. But I wasn't relying on a standard trace. I was waiting for him to make his move. While I waited, my eyes scanned the floor, and there, I saw it, a small white square of paper that hadn't been there before, lying just inside the door. My focus had been so absolute, so directed at the screen, that I had shut out the physical world entirely. I walked over and picked it up. I unfolded it. VPN Estonian service, Stockholm server, DNS, Veracity DNS, 8.2929.100. Naya. A surge of pride, fierce and hot, cut through the icy calm. She had done it. She had found a weapon. This wasn't just a clue, it was the key. His preferred VPN, his preferred server, his custom DNS resolver, a digital signature, a pattern of behavior. While he was cloaking himself in a dozen random proxies, it was likely he was still using the tools he trusted underneath. It was the information I needed to cut through the noise to find the signal. I immediately configured my network analyzer, telling it to ignore the chaotic sea of proxy addresses and to focus exclusively on traffic originating from that specific Stockholm server node, and being resolved by that specific DNS address. I was telling my system, ignore the decoys, look for him right here. And then it happened. A new alert flashed on my screen. This one bright red. Execution detected. Honeypot wallet transfer initiated. He had taken the bait. Greed had won. The $250,000 prize was too tempting to leave on the table. The moment he initiated the transfer, my smart contract, my little package of spies executed. His screen, wherever he was, would have shown a successful transaction. The crypto would be moving. He would be euphoric. But on my screen, a torrent of data was flooding my listening server. The die pack had exploded. The smart contract ripped through his layers of security. And because I now knew exactly what signature to look for thanks to Nea's note, the signal was instantly visible. My analyzer screamed to life. Match found. Stockholm Node 5 match found. Veracity DNS 8. And then, the final beautiful piece of information. The true IP address, stripped of all its protections. Saucer IP. 781010. I ran a geolocation trace. It was not a data center. It was not a coffee shop. It was a residential address. An apartment building in a drab working-class suburb of a city I did not recognize. But the system knew. A town called Radom in central Poland. The die pack wasn't finished. It was now siphoning a clone of his entire hard drive. Folders began appearing on my secure server. Victims. Blackmail. Code. And a folder simply named Nia filled with files that made my stomach clench with rage. I had it all. His location. His identity. His crimes. The complete, unvarnished proof. I opened a secure email client. I addressed it to a name from my past. A man who was now a deputy director at the FBI's cybercrime division. The subject line was simple. Gift. I attached the entire data package, the IP address, the logs, the cloned hard drive, a summary of the threats. Everything. I wrote a single line in the body of the email. This one is a predator. Go get him. I hit send. The data packet, a digital arrow aimed at the heart of his life, shot across the world. It was over. I had not just blocked him. I had not just defeated him. I had documented, packaged, and delivered his own ruin. The net had not just closed. It had vaporized him. The final keystroke of the email felt like a switch being thrown, cutting power to the massive engine of adrenaline and rage that had been driving me for hours. The hum of the secure server was the only sound in the office. The war was over, but the silence that descended was not one of peace. It was the heavy, echoing quiet of a battlefield after the fighting stops. I methodically shut down my systems, reversing the process of booting up. The secure machine went dark. The burner phone was placed back in its safe. I re-engaged the circuit breaker, and the soft, warm light returned to the office, feeling intrusive and artificial. Every muscle in my body ached with a tension I hadn't been aware of. I left the study, my sanctum, and the air in the hallway felt different, thick with unspoken words. I walked to Naya's room and used my key to unlock the door. She was sitting on the floor leaning against her bed, her sketchbook open on her lap, but she wasn't drawing. She was just staring at the blank page. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide and questioning. There was still fear in them, but something else now too, a fragile sliver of hope. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, the motion feeling heavy, sluggish. "It's over, he's gone." I expected relief. Tears of joy, something cathartic. Instead, she just gave a slow, shuddering nod, and looked back down at the empty page. The threat was gone, but the damage remained. An invisible crater in the center of our lives. I sat on the floor opposite her, the unfamiliar position feeling awkward. My joints protesting. For years, our interactions had been defined by a vertical power dynamic. I was the parent. She was the child. I was the provider. She was the protected. Now, sitting on the floor, we were just two people in the wreckage. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice so low I could barely hear it. "Mom, I'm so sorry." "I know," I said. And I did. But there were other things that needed to be said. "I need you to understand something, Nia," I began, my own voice sounding rusty, unused to this register of raw honesty. "The systems I build, the rules I have, I don't do it to control you." She looked up, a flicker of the old defiance in her eyes. "It feels like it." "I know," I admitted. "That's my failure. I build firewalls. It's what I do. After your father left, I built a fortress around us. Around the life I wanted for you. I thought if I could control every variable, I could keep you safe. I was wrong." I paused, the confession costing me more than I could have imagined. "My fortress," I continued, "had no doors. It kept the world out, but it also locked you in. You went looking for a window, for a breath of fresh air, and a monster crawled through." Tears began to trace paths through the grime on her cheeks. I was so stupid. I believed him. He said he understood me. He understood your vulnerabilities. I corrected gently. Predators have a genius for that. He saw your desire to be seen for who you are, your frustration with my control, and he twisted it into a key to unlock your trust. That is not your fault. It is his weapon. We sat in silence for a long time, the space between us filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken conversations, of years of misunderstanding. I had treated her life like a network to be secured, and she had rebelled by opening a port to the most dangerous corner of the internet. We were both culpable in the breach. The note, I said finally, breaking the silence, the information about his VPN and his DNS, that was critical. It was the key. Where did you get it? A tiny sad smile touched her lips. He bragged, she said. He was showing off how smart he was. I guess that was his vulnerability. Yes, I said. It was. In that moment, the dynamic between us shifted, subtly but seismically. She was not just the victim I had saved. She had been a vital part of the solution. She had provided the intelligence that had made the final move possible. She had been an asset, not a liability. The distance between us seemed to shrink. The fortress I had built was gone, its walls smashed to rubble by the day's events, and in its place, there was just this, two women, a mother and a daughter sitting on the floor, trying to figure out how to build something new, something better, something with a door they could manage together. Weeks later, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The silence was no longer heavy with tension or unspoken grief. It was calm, breathable. The FBI had moved quickly. The digital package I had sent them was a prosecutor's dream. Silas Glitch Cry, real name Tomasz Nowak, a disgruntled former programmer from Radom, Poland, was in custody awaiting extradition. His digital empire of blackmail and extortion had been dismantled. The ghost was gone. The true work, however, had just begun. The rebuilding. The setting for this new work was my office, but it was no longer just my office. The door was always open now. Naya was a frequent presence. Not as an intruder but as a student, a collaborator. I was sitting at my desk, she was in the chair opposite me, her laptop open. We weren't talking about her art or her classes or her future. We were performing a digital security audit of her entire life. Okay, I said, pointing to her screen. You see that app? The one that lets you share photos with funny filters? Let's look at the permissions you granted it. We dove into the settings. Access to her camera. Access to her microphone. Access to her contacts, access to her location data, even when the app wasn't running. Thank you for watching. Do you see? I asked. You wanted to put cartoon dog ears on a selfie, and to do it you handed them the keys to your entire social life and your physical location. It's a transaction. You're not the customer, you're the product. Nia's eyes, once clouded with the naivety that had made her a target, were now sharp, analytical. She wasn't just listening, she was learning, processing. So I should just delete all of them? Not necessarily, I said. This isn't about living in a cave, it's about understanding the price of admission. It's about making intentional choices. Does the value this app provides you, the fun, the connection, outweigh the data you're giving it? Sometimes it will. Sometimes it won't. The power is in the choice. This was our new ritual. I was teaching her everything. How to read the source code of a web page to see what trackers were hidden inside. How to use a VPN not just to hide, but to understand how data flows across the globe. How to create passwords that were not just strong but part of a larger personal security philosophy. But I wasn't just teaching her the technical skills. I was teaching her the psychology. We studied the techniques of social engineering. We read about cults, con artists, and charismatic manipulators. I was inoculating her, building up her intellectual antibodies to the kind of poison that Silas had used. In return, she was teaching me. She showed me the communities she loved, the digital art that inspired her. She explained the nuance, the culture, the language. I began to see the vibrant, creative world she was a part of, not as a landscape of threats but as a place of possibility. I had seen the internet as a hostile network full of bugs and exploits. She was showing me it could also be a canvas. One afternoon she came into my office with her tablet and showed me a piece of generative art she was working on. It was a complex, beautiful algorithm that created a constantly evolving fortress. But unlike my static, rigid fortress of old, hers was different. It was organic, fluid. Its walls were made of shimmering, interwoven lines of light. And it had a gate, a beautiful, ornate gate that was wide open. It's not finished, she said, but that's the idea. It's a system that's strong but also open. It recognizes threats and the walls shift to block them, but the gate stays open for the things that are safe. I stared at the screen, my heart swelling with a feeling that was deeper than just pride. It was understanding. She had taken the brutal lesson of the past few weeks and transformed it into art, into a metaphor for the new life we were building. "It's brilliant, Mia," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's the most brilliant system I've ever seen. We were rebuilding our trust, not on a foundation of maternal control or childish obedience, but on a new protocol of shared knowledge and mutual respect. The firewall between us had been reconfigured. We were a new network, stronger, smarter, and more resilient than before. The fortress had finally lowered its drawbridge, not in surrender but in a profound and hard-won act of trust.